As to the matter of the Kingsguard vows, and how to get out of them, when a knight, or the hound, kneels before the king, or queen on occasion, offers up their sword and accepts the white cloak, they forsake lands and set aside wives and children, and also swear a number of vows, hence acquire a number of duties. The first and most obvious, defend the king from harm and threat, and to give their blood for his and their lives as needed. Second, obey the king's commands. Third, keep their secrets. Fourth, provide counsel when asked, and remain silent when not. Fifth, serve the king's pleasure. This could be thought of as Sir Meryn beating Sansa for Joffrey's amusement, or Rhaenyra, though she's a princess not a queen, seducing Criston Cole. Criston Cole did nothing wrong in this case. Like the Night's Watch, the Kingsguard have a vow against taking wives and fathering children. This is to prevent divided loyalties. It is not a vow of celibacy, though it may sound like that to a simple mind. And serving the king's pleasure could be just simply getting them a drink. 6. Defend the king's name and honour. 7th. If required, provide protection to the other members of the king's family, and do no harm to the blood royal. These vows are usually for life, though there are exceptions, which I'll discuss later. The reason I bring this up is throughout A Song of Ice and Fire, as well as Fire and Blood, it is very strongly implied that vows have more power in them than just societal expectation and honour. There is a magic to certain vows in Martin's world. This is shown explicitly in the Night's Watch vow, which allows them to access the Black Door under the Night Fort. In the case of the Kingsguard vow, when the king or blood royal is in danger, it seems that knights in white are compelled to defend their charge. There are many examples, in text, of Kingsguard with questionable or divided loyalties, or even engaged in treasonous activities, suddenly pulling in a heel-about face and fighting to the death to protect a king they were meant to destroy. Starting with Joffery Doggett, a knight in the Faith Militant and later Grand Captain of the Warrior Sons, think Knights Templar except loyal to the Pope, who became Kingsguard to King Jaehaerys the Conciliator, after warring against his tyrannical uncle, King Maegor, in support of an uprising of the faith against the incestuous and polygamous mating practices of House Targaryen. Sir Joffrey then becomes witness and defender of King Jaehaerys' marriage to his own sister Alysanne, even joining the other Kingsguard in preventing an annulment of this marriage by the Hand and the Queen Dowager. Sir Marston Waters, Lord Commander under Aegon III, by appointment of his regent Lord Unwin Peake, was another weird example. Lord Peake aspired to rule the Seven Kingdoms through the child king Aegon III, and was not above murdering the child queens of Aegon, in hopes of advancing his own daughter. He also stacked the king's council and guard with his own men. Sir Marston was one of these men. However, during the secret siege of Maegor's Holdfast in 135 AC, Sir Marston, now Hand of the King, and his confederates attempted to seize control of the king on the disgraced Lord Unwin's behalf, allegedly. However, on the 18th day of the siege, after presenting a tortured confession to negotiate with the boy ruler, having been shown it to be a false confession by the king's brother, later Viserys II, and the king's fool, Mushroom, finally, King Aegon directly ordered Sir Marston to arrest his co-conspirators, and he died in the attempt. Though, it is worth noting that two false Kingsguard, Sir Amory Peake and Sir Merwin Flowers, persisted in the plot, or fled and died. However, they did not receive explicit orders from their king. When the king gives an order, the sworn brothers must obey, and will obey. It is not a choice. Aegon III's trauma and permissiveness allowed these wayward Kingsguard great leniency in interpreting their vows. However, for a treasonous or insubordinate vassal, putting their own man in the Kingsguard risks them becoming an unreliable agent, as Peter Baelish tells Sansa in A Storm of Swords. So one of the Kettleblacks put the poison in Joff's cup, Sir Osmond had been near the king all night, she remembered. Did I say that? Lord Peter cut the blood orange in two with his dagger, and offered half to Sansa. The lads are far too treacherous to be part of any such scheme, and Osmond has become especially unreliable since he joined the Kingsguard. That white cloak does things to a man, I find. Even a man like him. Sansa 6, A Storm of Swords. Now consider the formation of the Kingsguard. In the beginning, Aegon the Conqueror kept a regular guard when not riding his dragon. However, during the first Dornish invasion, escalating animosity between House Targaryen and the Dornish led to several assassination attempts on King Aegon. His surviving sister queen, Visenya, sick of having to save his life, came to insist regular guards were insufficient to protect him, personally demonstrating their incompetence by cutting his cheek with her sword before said guards could react. Following his reluctant admission, she was correct, Visenya organised the creation of the Kingsguard, to be comprised of the finest warriors from the most prestigious families to act as dedicated bodyguards. This is a double-edged sword, as whilst the second and third sons of noble families will have an education in warfare, swordplay, and various ancillary skills superior to that of the common man, and they make valuable hostages to boot, the noble families they are drawn from would benefit most from a spy in the king's presence or a ready assassin. Whilst Visenya crafted an extensive set of vows and traditions for the nascent Kingsguard, vows can be broken. Queen Visenya was a cold, harsh, pragmatic woman who left little to chance, and she was rumoured to be a sorceress as well. Thus, the risk of a faithless Kingsguard could be mitigated with a little magic to strengthen those vows. There is this concept from Celtic folklore, which I'd like to introduce to you. It's called a Geas, or Gesh. A Geas is an idiosyncratic taboo, which is to mean it is for a single person rather than a society as a whole. This can be an obligation, which is something you must do, or a prohibition, which is something you must not do. It is similar to being under a vow or a curse, yet the observance of which can also bring about power and blessings, when you act in alignment with this vow, this Geas. You can see how this might be useful in the bodyguard of a king who must both proactively act in the king's interests, as well as being unable to act against the king's interests, in theory. And while a Geas can be compared with a curse, or possibly even a gift of sorts, if someone who is under this Geas violates the associated terms of the Geas, the taboo, the person doing so will suffer dishonour or even death. And an additional point to note here is that commonly it was women who would place such Geashes upon men, either to send them out onto some great quest to get them out of their comfort zone, per se, or to prevent them from doing something objectionable. And this woman would often be a goddess or some sovereignty figure, like a queen. Now, Marston does have an interest in various sorts of folklore, and the question you might ask is, does a Geas ever appear in the Song of Ice and Fire and related materials? And the answer is yes. After the Dance of the Dragons, Alys Rivers, who you may know from the House of the Dragon series, season 2, took up a seat inside Harrenhal's ruins and amassed itself an army of outlaws and other such witchy folk. When the Crown sent emissaries to recapture the castle, she set her men on them and supposedly killed a member of the Kingsguard with magic, perhaps. Of the 100 men in the delegation, 32 made it out alive. The next day, a 33rd made his appearance. Having been captured with a dozen others, he had been forced to watch them die by torture, one by one, before being turned loose to deliver a warning. "I'm to tell you what she said," he gasped, "but you cannot laugh. The widow put a curse on me. Any man or you laughs, I die." When Sir Daemon assured him that no one was going to laugh at him, the messenger said,
"Don't come again unless you mean to bend your knees," she says. "Any man who comes near her walls will die. There's a power in them stones, and the widow's woken it. 7 save us all, she has a dragon, I seen it." The name of the messenger is lost to us, along with the name of the man who laughed at him. But someone did, one of Lord Dowy's men. The messenger looked at him, stricken, then clutched at his throat and began to wheeze. Unable to draw breath, he was dead in moments. Supposedly, the imprints of a woman's fingers could be seen upon his skin, as if she had been in the room, choking him. This, though perhaps much more ostentatious than in the old folklore, is a gish. This is a one-off, as far as I can tell, and the creature of Alys Rivers is much more in tune with the old gods than, say, the fires of old Valyria. However, we should note that Visenya modelled her vows on the vows of the Night's Watch, and the Night's Watch are incredibly old, forged, as it were, by the first men and the children of the forest, or near enough to.
So this notion of a mind-controlled Kingsguard isn't as absurd as it sounds, even if that power is entirely based in where men believe it resides. So, how do you get around the Kingsguard vows? For there are many examples of Kingsguard who seem to work against their rightful king or queen. Consider the Dance of the Dragons, and Sir Criston Cole, known as the Kingmaker to history, actively deciding who would sit the throne next. But we see, at least in House of the Dragon, he could not actively oppose King Viserys and his Lord Commander's orders. It was only once Viserys died, and the throne was vacant, did he have the freedom to act. Thus, if a Kingsguard outlives their previous king, they are free until they choose to serve another. The next most famous Kingsguard to exist in defiance of their king would be Prince Aemon the Dragonknight, perhaps one of the most storied Kingsguard in terms of piety, skill at arms, one of the only Targaryen princes to serve in the order, serving first Aegon III, to Aegon IV his brother, and 3 monarchs in between. This Lancelot-like figure was rumoured to have committed adultery and high treason by sleeping with their sister Queen Nerys, and siring the Crown Prince Daeron. King Aegon IV, jealous and suspicious of his siblings and son, indirectly accused them, through a proxy, Sir Morgul. These accusations were quashed when Aemon defeated Sir Morgul in a trial by combat. Aemon later went on to die in defence of his loathed brother when Aegon IV was attacked by brothers of another Kingsguard, Sir Terence Tywin, who bedded Aegon's mistress. Like Rhaenyra and Sir Criston, perhaps a Kingsguard tasked to protect another on the king's behalf is allowed to see to their charge's pleasure as well, at least in terms of the vow. The rest of the world's understanding of the vow's limitations is flawed, and may judge according to their own code. As in the case of Sir Jaime the Kingslayer Lannister. I've discussed in a previous video how Jaime was able to slay Aerys in spite of the magic of the vow. That explanation being that a knight's vow, and that of the vow of service, prohibits the lord from ordering a vassal or household knight into a dishonourable act. Specifically in this case, kinslaying and patricide, which in Westeros is considered worse than killing your king. When Aerys ordered Jaime to slay Tywin, the Kingsguard spell was rendered null and void. Now better read A Song of Ice and Fire fans might rebut this, with the tale of Sir Eric and Sir Aric, twins who joined the Kingsguard during the reign of Viserys I, and ended up split during the dance. Sir Aric Cargyll served Aegon II, Sir Eric served Rhaenyra. After the events of Blood and Cheese, Aegon, in retribution, sent Sir Aric to Dragonstone to slay Rhaenyra, posing as his brother Sir Eric. Eric stumbled upon Aric, and they slew one another, in service to their monarchs, tears flowing from their eyes. The difference here was that Aegon didn't order Aeric to slay his twin. I suspect that if Tywin entered the throne room, drew his sword, and tried to slay Aerys himself, Jaime would have been compelled to slay his own father. But because Tywin did not pose a clear and present danger to Aerys' life, his preemptive order to slay Tywin was what broke the hold over Jaime. The various competing vows and oaths Jaime speaks of are much like Asimov's laws of robotics. To the layman, the three laws have a clear hierarchy. Prevent harm to humans comes first. Then is to follow human orders, except where it will clash with the first law. And lastly, the robot will protect its own existence, except where it clashes with the first or second law. However, to a roboticist, the code in the positronic brain creates a series of sophisticated heuristics which judge incoming sensory data and judge which law takes priority, even allowing robots to protect their own existence over obedience to human orders, or to allow individuals or groups of humans to die, or even kill humans. This is most obvious in the unofficial zeroth law, wherein collective survival of humanity trumps individual human safety or liberty. Outside of explicit orders, or life-threatening conditions, the Kingsguard have some play in what they can and cannot do. Permissive monarchs, like Viserys II or Aegon III, might allow their Kingsguard to run roughshod over them, or tasking a white sword to guard another enables a transfer of some protections and duties to the Gardaí. Criston can see to Rhaenyra's pleasure, beat Sir Joffery to death for impugning her honour, counsel Alicent in her schemes, etc., because it is part of the spell. Sir Arthur Dayne and Sir Osber Went had greater latitude when assigned to Prince Rhaegar, obeyed his orders, kept his secrets. But when Sir Gerald the Lord Commander arrived, bearing the King's commands, I suspect they were compelled to obey, even over Rhaegar's wishes, or their own. It may be that Sir Gerald held Lyanna captive to compel Rhaegar back into Aerys' service, since whilst the Kingsguard could not harm the King's blood, except under the direct orders, or for the explicit defence of said King, the Prince's mistress was another matter. And those orders persisted after news of Aerys and Rhaegar's deaths, thus the fight with Eddard's not-so-magnificent Seven. If the Queen commanded me to protect his star, I would have had no choice but to obey. But Daenerys Targaryen had never established a proper Queen's Guard, even for herself, nor issued any commands in respect to her consort. The world was simpler when I had a Lord Commander to decide such matters, Selmy reflected. Now I am the Lord Commander, and it is hard to know which path is right. The Queen's Guard, a dance with dragons. It may be that following the death of Aerys, the secrets of controlling the Kingsguard were lost, and thus the new dynasty could not compel their White Knights into great deeds, but who knows? In any case, if you have taken the vow, how do you get out? Given the nature of the Brotherhood, the only acceptable way to leave is feet first. One of King Joffrey's first acts was to dismiss Sir Barristan from the Kingsguard. This didn't free Barry from his obligation. He'd been a sworn brother most of his life. He was institutionalized. He needed someone to serve. Sir Boris Blunt was dismissed for cowardice, but was reinstated by Tywin, and when Tywin tried to dismiss Jaime, he also refused, in an attempt to restore his honour. The royal dismissal, in honourable retirement, is too recent to apply to the three at the Tower. There is one sure way to leave the Kingsguard with your life. Join the Night's Watch. In lieu of death, a sentence can be commuted to life on the wall. 4 of the Kingsguard who served Maegor took the black after his death. During the reign of Jaehaerys the Conciliator, Sir Lucamore Strong broke his vows and fathered 16 children on 3 wives, and was sent to the wall after being gilded by his sworn brothers. In a legal sense, the Night's Watch vows would cancel out the vows of the Kingsguard, and if there is a magical element to the vows of the White Cloak, the vows of the Black might render them moot. and given the wall's capacity to disrupt some magical abilities, living beyond the wall, and hence beyond the law of the Seven Kingdoms, may be a second chance for someone otherwise bound up in oaths and reputation.
Now, I would be remiss if I didn't admit to a possible error I made earlier, when I suggested the Kingsguard were not required to be celibate. In the passage wherein Sir Lucanor is found guilty of marrying outside of his vows, there's this particular quote by Joffery. Sir Lucanor, you swore a sacred vow before gods and men to defend me and mine with your own life, to obey me, fight for me, die for me if need be. You also swore to take no wife, father no children, and remain chaste. If you could shrug aside the second vow so easily, why should I believe you would honour the first? This may lead you to believe that Kingsguard indeed must remain celibate, but the point is, I would have to make, in terms of pedantry, is that chastity isn't celibacy. Celibacy is contained within the subset of chastity within certain cultures and religions. It is perhaps seen as the highest form of chastity, but is not the only form of chastity. Chastity can also include monogamous sexual unions between married partners. Celibacy is the refrain from any sexual activity, whereas chastity is the refrain from any immoral sexual activity.
In terms of the Kingsguard's vows, fathering children or marrying a wife creates divided loyalties, thus is not chaste, whereas obeying your protectees' orders and satisfying their desires would be considered chaste, though not in a public sense per se, but in terms of the vow itself having its own sort of consciousness. But I believe Visenya crafted the vows with a certain spirit to them which weren't necessarily in line with the Faith of the Seven and typical Westerosi moral standards. This discussion will continue in the next video, but there's a few points I'd like to bring up. Firstly, since the creator of the Kingsguard, Queen Visenya, doesn't herself keep to the Faith of the Seven, it is fair to say that the Kingsguard are not especially bound to that particular worldview, even though they are almost entirely drawn from knights who are from the Faith of the Seven by definition. This could be illustrated in Visenya's case, when Maegor shocked the realm in 39 AC by announcing that he had taken a second wife, Alys of House Harroway, whose seat was Harrenhal, by the way. In secret, he had wed her in a Valyrian ceremony officiated by Queen Visenya, for want of a septon willing to wed them. The public outcry was such that Aenys was finally forced to exile his brother. The Targaryen kings, Aenys I, the world of ice and fire. The design of the Kingsguard was first to serve the king. Thereafter, in the king's service, they may obey the Lord Commander, but owe no loyalty to the Hand nor the Regent. This is shown, but as his men moved forward, the 7 knights of Jaehaerys' Kingsguard stepped up and drew their swords. "Come no closer," warned Sir Giles Morgan. "Any man who lays a hand upon our king and queen shall die today." Lord Rhaegar was dismayed. "Sheathe your steel and move aside," he commanded. "Have you forgotten? I am the king's hand." "Aye," old Sour Sam answered, "but we're the king's guard, not the hand's guard, and it's the lad who sits the chair, not you." Page 142. The Year of the Three Brides, Fire and Blood. This will be important in considering the 2 Kingsguard who did not obey the king, King Aegon III, during the Secret Siege. Unwin Peake then set aside all of the king's appointments and arrangements, on the grounds that no boy of 12 had the judgment to decide on such weighty matters himself. I should point out that Jaehaerys was also underage when he took a stand against his Lord Hand, Rhaegar Baratheon. Marston Waters was confirmed as Lord Commander of the Kingsguard, whilst Darklan and Massey,
two of whom were chosen by Aegon III to be Kingsguard, were commanded to surrender their white cloaks. Having elevated Sir Marston Waters to command of the Kingsguard, Lord Peake now prevailed upon him, Sir Marston in this case, to confer white cloaks on two of his own kin, his nephew, Sir Amory Peake, and his bastard brother, Sir Mervyn Flowers. Under the Regents, War and Peace and Cattle Shows, page 622, Fire and Blood. Sir Amory Peake disobeyed the king and tried to seize him, though was killed, and Sir Mervyn Flowers stabbed his own Lord Commander, who came to detain him before getting killed during an escape. I suspect that Darklan and Massey, who were appointed by the boy king Aegon III, were in fact the true Kingsguard, and even stripped of their white cloaks, they retained that status. Sir Amory Peake and Sir Mervyn Flowers are false Kingsguard. They may wear the cloak, and were officially as part of the Kingsguard, but in truth they were not, bound by the vows, thus were free to serve Lord Unwin rather than Aegon. I suppose that the Kingsguard vow is similar to a Geas, in that those that embrace their vows become more powerful, and those that break them may suddenly die, near structures like Harrenhal. Some say that Alys Rivers merely raised a hand, and Sir Regis began to scream and clutch his head, until his skull burst apart, spraying blood and brains. The messenger said, "Don't come again unless you mean to bend your knees," she says. "Any man who comes near her walls will die. There's power in them stones, and the widow's woken it. Under the Regents, the hooded hand, fire and blood." In my next video, I plan to explore who is the rightful king and order of succession. As there may be such a thing as a false Kingsguard, there can also be such a thing as a false king. So who is the true king of Seven Kingdoms may determine who the vow requires the real Kingsguard to serve. In the case of Sir Regis getting his head exploded by Alys Rivers, a great magical construct like Harrenhal, made by Harren the Black, possibly with sorcerous intent, could compel people to keep to vows, under threat of death,